Laura Webster is joining us right now, and Laura is the new editor of The National. Laura, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. How are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Just to let you know, I'm getting over the flu, so my voice is a little bit shaky, but I'm sure I'll get through it. It'll be okay.
You and I both, I've been sneezing and coughing all day,
Oh
so
no.
everyone, thankfully, diseases can't be transmitted via YouTube, so I think all of our viewers will be safe. So obviously you have recently got a new job at the National. So firstly, congratulations
Thank you.
as on your new post. To start things off, what's your vision for the National now you're editing the paper?
So I've been at the National for coming up on 5 years this year, and I started off as a sub-editor. So I learned a lot from just proofreading the paper every day. And then I was our digital audience and content editor for the last year. I've been the news and features editor. And as of last month, I'm now the editor. So yeah, I absolutely love this newspaper. I love that we're the only pro-independence daily newspaper in Scotland. Like, we're giving a voice to the movement that needs to be heard. So I think that is the key thing, is that we do represent those voices within the independence movement across the broader independence movement. I really want to put a focus on representing the grassroots as well. I think there's so much exciting stuff going on with campaigning movements in Scotland that are not directly linked to the like the SNP and the Scottish government. There's tons going on. I want to be a space for new writers and young voices to come on board, because we have to represent a vision of a progressive, independent Scotland. We have to give something to people that they want to vote for and they're motivated to get involved with. And I think there's lots of ways we can do that. So I'm excited we'll be unveiling some new columnists in the next few weeks. And I think another key part of it as well is that I really want to reach out to the Labour yesers. So we know from polling that about a third of Labour voters in Scotland are pro-independence, and their views are not being properly represented by their party. So somebody needs to stand up and say, look, there's a space for you within this independence movement. It doesn't have to be combative. We don't have to say, no, you're not part of this. Like, we want you to be part of this. So that's going to be my big focus in the year ahead, is reaching out to them and the trade union movement and making sure that they feel their voices are heard. And, these people are still voting for Labour, although they believe in independence. So how do we represent those views? Another thing is, because I've done this digital role in the past, I'm really keen to introduce a bit more multimedia focus. So about a year and a half ago, we launched our national TikTok, which has done really, really well. And I think there's obviously a lot of space for young people who maybe don't want to read the paper every day in full, but they like little snippets about what's going on in the independence movement. So that's been really successful for us. And hopefully we'll be launching a video podcast as well, along the lines of what would an independent Scotland do? So that'll be every 2 weeks, and we'll be interviewing different experts in different sectors about how an independent Scotland could do things differently to what's going on right now. So for instance, we could be talking about the NHS. How could we better fund our NHS and make sure these waiting lists are down in an independent Scotland? Or how we could help with the strikes, for example, how we could better pay our workers and make sure they're getting the respect that they deserve. So I think that'll be a really exciting opportunity to put forward how we could do things differently in independent Scotland, because for the past few years, a lot of the focus has been on this constitutional wrangling back and forth, which can be a little bit off-putting to people. They feel, why are you so focused on the Supreme Court and, how Section 30 works, when we could be talking about actual domestic issues that are going on. So I'm very excited to continue the work that we've already been doing so well, but just build on that a little.
So there's loads that you've talked about there that I want to come back to, and that last point about the constitutional wrangling, we've already had some questions come through in the chat about that, so I will pick that up towards the end. But before I do that, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of the National in the wider movement for Scottish independence. So you said there early on that the National is the only daily paper that supports independence, and obviously the paper was sort of born out of the 2014 referendum and the kind of the intellectual and organizational things that came out of that particular moment. But what role do you see the National having in the wider campaign and movement for independence?
I think there's a few. So obviously on a day-to-day basis, the media here in Scotland and across the UK more so is quite hostile to independence. So our real main role is just making sure that we represent the voices that are pro-independence. I think it's still a challenge, honestly. Even in some sort of journalism circles, people kind of look down on the National because it is that alternative viewpoint, but somebody has to say it. I would absolutely love if more of the unionist kind of papers decided to be more vocal and give more of a space to independent supporters. They don't have to come out in full favor of it like we have, but it's healthy to have different views represented. So I love that we do that. And I think that is our main role. But obviously moving towards India F2, hopefully, and further campaigning, it's really important that there's a space for a debate about different issues on independence. So I take that really seriously, that there's lots of different views within the movement that need to be heard, especially on some of the bigger issues that maybe don't have solid answers that everybody can get behind yet, like currency. Making sure that we can give people the space to debate that, because there are lots of different views on it. And if you go to the main kind of unionist papers, they're only ever going to give you the negative view about, why it wouldn't work. But we have to be able to give people a voice to explain, well, there's this position, these are the benefits and these are the disadvantages. So I think we had a really interesting piece from Richard Murphy after the last independence paper came out about currency. Now he's really opposed to the Scottish government's plan to move to a new currency as soon as it's practicable. He argues that it should be a new currency from day one. And so these are the really interesting conversations that I think the National has a really important role in being able to kind of platform. And also just celebrating the positives about Scotland. I think this is a huge problem that we have in the media in Scotland, is a kind of reluctance to talk about the positive things that happen here, not specifically to do with the government or the SNP or the Greens or anything like that, but just positive stories about Scotland, whether that's about businesses or amazing charities. I think it's important that we're able to kind of platform those stories and show that there's so much to be proud of in Scotland and there's so much amazing stuff going on. So that doesn't often get heard enough in the kind of mainstream titles. But yeah, that's what I see as our role.
So you touched on something there that I wanted to pick up, which is, I guess, differences and disagreements within the independence movement. And there are some pretty stark differences, I'd say, on not just the vision for what an independent Scotland would look like, but also on a whole bunch of other issues sort of internally within the movement. So for the most obvious, most recent one that's kind of hit the headlines has been the pretty significant internal disagreements within the SNP over the Gender Recognition Act reform and on trans rights. There's also obviously the two parties of government in Scotland at the moment, the SNP and the Scottish Greens, have pretty fundamental differences on a whole bunch of things, whether it be, on an independent Scotland's membership of NATO, a whole bunch of other issues. As the daily newspaper of, I guess, the independence movement, or the only one that does support independence, how do you see the paper covering those disagreements and differences within the movement?
Well, I think we've had quite a bit of experience with doing that already. So obviously, if we go back to the Holyrood election and Alex Salmond launched the ALBA party, and that was obviously quite a big moment for the movement, because until that point, things had been pretty settled. There was the SNP and there was the Greens, and then there's smaller fringe parties as well. But having such a person who'd been such a significant figure within the movement go and do his own party, there was obviously a big kind of schism that happened because of that. And quite a few thousand members of the SNP have switched over to ALBA. And obviously you want to represent the views of the majority, but it's also important to kind of give the space to make sure that conversations from ALBA are heard as well. So that was a bit of a challenge for us going into that election, because it was so different to how we've been used to doing things. But we've just made sure that we kind of send our reporters to cover conferences across the country from all kinds of organizations and all of the parties. On gender recognition, I think the most people in the SNP, I think, support the changes for gender recognition reform, but obviously that was quite a controversial topic for a lot of our readers. Like, not everybody was on the same page, whether that's right or wrong. And basically, you just have to kind of platform it in a way that isn't going to harm any specific groups or minority groups. And I think we did a really good job of covering it. We have people at Holyrood every day, unfortunately staying until well after midnight some nights, because the Tories were making sure that everything was as disrupted as possible. But yeah, I think it's just making sure that you're giving a broad kind of section of viewpoints across the movement. I think it's healthy, actually, for the independence movement to have all of these groups and different representatives, because it's a challenge for the SNP to be able to be this broad group that can represent everybody's views, because there's so many different opinions within the movement. Of course, that's going to cause a lot of tension. So I think it's good that it's split up into different places now, because there was a lot of tension pre 2021 Holyrood election, and I think that was causing a lot of issues for the party and stealing a lot of kind of focus on what they wanted to talk about and what the other groups wanted to talk about. So yeah, it works. It works now. I think it works. There's still a lot of division within the movement. A lot of that, I think, is just kind of Twitter scrambling, because when you go to independence events and you have people from SNP, ALBA, the Greens, these other groups, people aren't shouting at each other. It tends to just happen online.
It's a general, I think, lesson for most of politics there, not just the independence movement, that the shouting tends to happen on Twitter. So I've got a final question for you before I move to some of the questions from the chat. But before I go there, I just wanted to, for our viewers, please do get questions in the chat now, so that I can put as many of them to Laura as possible. So my final question for you is around levels of support for Scottish independence at the moment. I wondered if you could talk through your kind of assessment of how strong support is for independence at the moment.
Sure, I think we're in quite a good place just now. So most of the recent polling has shown that we have a slight majority. That's been mostly after the Supreme Court decision. So for those who are unaware, the Supreme Court basically said that the way that devolution is set up, Holyrood cannot hold an independence referendum without explicit permission from Westminster. And that in itself has caused a lot of conversation about how is this a voluntary union if the one of the partners is not allowed to leave without the other's explicit permission. So I think that's actually opened up a bit of dialogue about where we go next, because before that, like I was saying earlier, there was a lot of constitutional wrangling back and forth. And now we know, okay, these are the provisions that we're working under. There has to be a Section 30 order, or we need to figure out some other kind of way forward. So the SNP is holding this special conference on March 19th in Edinburgh, which is going to be looking at how they do the de facto referendum. I think that is a bit of a contentious subject. There's a lot of disagreement on the right way to do it. So getting everybody into one room and kind of forcing them to figure it out, I think, will be quite advantageous for the independence movement. The other thing is, I did read some quite interesting polling analysis recently, which suggested that this boost in support for independence is maybe not directly linked to the Supreme Court. It's more to do with the terrible governance from Westminster. I don't think that would be too much of a surprise to anybody, but the way that the cost of living crisis is, the government's hostility to migrants and refugees and trade unions, all of this is very much at odds with the kind of political culture in Scotland right now. And it does make England and Scotland feel like very separate places with very separate ideas of what we need to do. So Brexit has had a massive impact too, and people are aware that we have big challenges in Scotland with, for example, being able to staff our industries properly, because we have fewer EU workers, and Scotland has a declining population as well. So being able to kind of put forward arguments in favour of migration and bringing in more people to Scotland, it stands very much in opposition to what Westminster is all about right now. But on the other side to that, Labour are not really inspiring any hope here in Scotland either. I think Keir Starmer it doesn't really get Scotland 100%. And some of the, I mean, that's saying it lightly, but I'll be diplomatic about it. I think, for example, he made some comments last year towards the end of the year about there being too many foreign workers in the NHS. And that really got a lot of people's backs up here in Scotland, because I mean, where is that coming from? If anything, we need more people from further seas. Like, we need there to be more people in the NHS to make it work effectively. Now, obviously, there's a whole conversation to be had about the fact that we need to be training more people in the UK, but that in itself goes along with, you know, it's harder for people to get into nursing or study medicine than it used to be, especially in England. So all of these kind of comments, they really do fuel support for independence. And they make it seem like there's not an alternative if we stick in the union and there's a Labour government, which it looks like there will be. Will there really be any kind of substantive change? And for most people with Keir Starmer in charge, I think the answer to that question is no, very much no. The UK government also kind of steamrolling parts of devolution is a bit of a big issue here as well, which fuels support. So the most recent example being, it looks like they might challenge the gender recognition reform bill in the Supreme Court. And obviously that could go either way, but most kind of legal experts are saying this is not really an issue of law. This is an issue of just them wanting to fuel this culture war and look like they're in control, but ultimately that will backfire. And whenever there's these issues, it happened with, there was the Children's Rights Bill last year as well. People really dislike the idea that Westminster can just veto Scottish legislation that they see as being well within the rights of devolution and should be possible under the Scotland Act. So all of these things come together, and I think that they really help the cause. Obviously, the way the cost of living crisis is, Scotland is an energy rich nation, and people can see that because we have oil and gas, and obviously that's not really the path that we want to go down, but we also have this massive renewable capacity. And the fact is that there are people in Aberdeen who can't afford to put their heating on, despite the fact that their resources have been what's been getting the UK economy to this point over the years. So all of that really draws attention to the fact that we should have control over our own resources and our own institutions. And I think that will sort of power the movement going forward as well.
So I said I'll go to the chat, but I have actually got one question to pick up on something you talked about there, which is around the Labour Party. So obviously you kind of made the case there that that there won't be significant difference if we do get a Labour government in the next couple of years. I guess one argument that I guess people, unionists and Labour supporters often talk about is the role of kind of political reform within the union. And so we've just recently had Gordon Brown's set of proposals for the Labour Party policy, which includes things like slightly more devolution, not just at a national level, but also at a regional level, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I wondered if you think that if those proposals that Gordon Brown has come out with, or any other wider package of kind of democratic reforms, would dampen the kind of mood and support for independence.
Not at all, to be honest. I mean, the day that the report came out, we were sitting in the newsroom and we were going through it. And our initial thought was just, is this it? Is this what they see as radical change for the way the UK works? In my view, it really doesn't go far enough. Abolishing the House of Lords, fantastic. We should have been doing that for much longer. Like, this should have been done already. But the reality is Labour have been talking about abolishing the House of Lords for, what is it, 112 years or something like that. Why should we possibly believe that they have any intention of doing that now? And obviously the report that Gordon Brown did is just a series of recommendations. Keir Starmer could just ignore it. Keir Starmer has broken his promises several times before. What happened with the 10 pledges? So we have no real reason to have any faith that those changes would happen at all. But in general, it just isn't going far enough, and it's not the kind of change that we want to see here. People have a real passion about the borders situation, and if we can't have control over our own borders, and not in the sense of Brexiteers, but in the sense of being able to decide on migration and migration targets, that is a huge part of Scotland's future. If our population keeps declining in the way that it is, we're going to have big problems further down the road, and we're already seeing them now. So that is the kind of radical change that we need. We need to have control over immigration, and we need to have control over things like the welfare state. And it's fine that we have some benefits that we can give out here now. That obviously does make a difference, but it's mitigating the damage that's coming from Westminster. And just being able to do these little bits and pieces around the edges, it's not going to make any significant change. And I just don't see people energized by it at all. I mean, obviously my kind of the responses I was picking up when the Brown Report came out was from the independence movement, but there was also a lot of constitutional experts saying this isn't radical enough and this won't make significant change. So it's not just coming from yesers who are saying that.
So we're going to delve into lots more about the conversation about the Brown Report later in the show when we have Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy on. So we're going to be unpicking that in more depth. But while we've still got Laura, we've got a great question from the chat from Dave Callow. And so I said earlier we'd talk about the constitutional wrangling a little bit, and Dave's question is about that. So Dave says that they fully support Scottish independence, but obviously the Westminster government is getting in the way of this. How does the independence movement circumvent the Westminster government on this?
I think this is the big challenge that we have. Obviously, support is strong right now, and with a campaign, it could probably be taken up a lot further. But how we actually get to Indiref 2 is the big talking point, and it now has been for several years. So, as I said before, the Supreme Court says pretty explicitly that we need to have a Section 30 order from Westminster. So right now, the SNP's plan is to use the next general election as a de facto referendum. So 50% plus one would be enough to start negotiations. Now, of course, there's a lot of questions around how that would work, and that's why they're doing that special conference later in the year, because the UK government could ultimately still turn around, even if there was 55% or something crazy for the SNP at Westminster election, and say, well, we're just not going to negotiate with you. And then what do you do at that stage? So it's not necessarily going to take us to that point of definitely this will secure independence, but there's lots of conversations that will be had about that in the coming months. So as well, after the election, I think some people would hope that Labour would potentially grant a Section 30 order, but Keir Starmer has been really clear that that's not something he plans to do. He said no deals with the SNP at all. So it seems unlikely that the SNP would offer their support to a potential Labour government, whether that's a minority government or a coalition, if there wasn't going to be that Section 30 order returned. So I think it would be more likely that you would see a Labour Lib Dem coalition if it came to it, that Labour needed that support. So yeah, it's all up in the air right now. I'm afraid I don't have a strong answer for you, but when we do, I'll let you know. You can read all about it in the National.
I was just going to say that the best way you can find the answers to these questions is to read the National. So for our viewers, please do that. Laura, I'm going to let you get on with the rest of your Sunday. As always, it's been brilliant to chat to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's been fantastic. Cheers.